Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Stop LAPD Spying webinar. Hamid, if you would do us the honors of what number this webinar is, because I've lost track at this point.
This is webinar number 59 since March 24th, 2020. So we've only missed 2 weeks.
Okay, so this is webinar 59. And the title of this webinar today is Siege, Banishment, and Containment, looking at data-driven policing from Skid Row to Palestine. So I want to welcome and thank everybody who is here today with us to have a very deeply rooted conversation about the various forms of surveillance technology, policing, and militarization that is used to contain, control, criminalize, and ultimately banish people, communities, families from land that is rightly ours, that we have the right to be human, to breathe, to eat, to love, to live, to thrive on. So before we get into this conversation, which will take us through the next 2 hours, I wanted to just invite people to our home and let you know a little bit about the reason why you're muted right now and how we will open the space up for engagement. So everybody does enter into the space. You're able to turn your camera on, but you are muted at this point. And the chat goes to the hosts and the co-hosts of the event. And this is primarily because we've experienced in a few of our webinars attacks from people, and they've been vulgar, violent, and just disruptive in the space that we're trying to create. So it's a way that it's a manner of how we take care of each other to be sure if these things start to happen, that there are certain people that are skilled at removing folks from the room that are not here to have deeply engaging and uplifting and working conversations. And then also throughout the webinar, you are able to post comments or questions into the chat. We'll read your comments. We'll even invite you to open up your mic to, speak your comment out loud if you like. If not, we'll read it. You can also ask your questions. We'll ask you if you want to, or we can read your question for you. And then there'll be times too when we feel like the space is good that we'll unmute everybody. So watch out for that in case you are just listening and we unmute you by accident and you just want to mute yourself so we don't pick up the background noise. And I think that's it. This is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded and you don't want your name recorded, you can also change that up on Zoom and make sure you leave your camera off. Other than that, I think that is all of our housekeeping items. So anything else I missed in regards to that, Hamid, or is that good? That's good. Okay, so let's begin and kind of get into this conversation. So my name is Jamie Garcia, and I've been a member of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition for about 10 years. And this is a really special webinar for me. Because I feel that so many of our struggles are not only felt deeply at home in the relationships that we have with our communities, but we realize that they are felt internationally. We realize the weapons of war that we experience on our streets are also experienced abroad. We know that the experimentation that occurs on our streets are exchanged with the experiments that are occurring in other communities, particularly today centering the communities of Skid Row and Palestine, both looking for liberation, for freedom, for the right to live, the right to thrive. And we are going to get into how this all correlates to data-driven policing, specifically looking at programs that LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, has developed, ideas and methodologies that they've exchanged with the Israeli military, Israeli policing. We know of the exchange of information that occurs between LAPD and Israel. And today we want to get into not only what are those particular programs, but what are the impacts and how do they look on each side of the world. So I want to first ground in talking about where this work comes from. We are a working group This is the data-driven policing working group that is within the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Every fourth Tuesday, we like to share with the community what we've been up to, where we're at in our fight, and really invite you to join us. Find a place to, to jump in, whether it's through art, whether it's through research, whether through it's organizing or talking, or how being a thought partner, however it is you feel that you have the power to engage, we invite you to join us. So this particular working group meets the first Monday and the third Monday of the month. And like I said, the fourth Tuesday is when we share out more of what we are doing. The first Monday's working group is particularly looking at the land and policing, right? So to back up just a little bit, where that working group grew out of was our original fight against predictive policing that was coming out of the Los Angeles Police Department. We call it, the original fight was called the fight against predictive policing. And in some senses, it is the predictive policing 1.0 that LAPD launched, because there is a type of 2.0 that we'll get into and what they are inflicting onto our communities. But this first fight was particularly looking at a program called Predictive and a program called Operation Laser, LA Strategic Extraction and Restoration. We fought those two programs. We organized through multiple types of organizing, from a legal fight to fights at the police commission, to focus groups and engaging in the community, to community-based research, and all that culminating together for us to officially dismantle both of these programs by 2020 of last year, actually. In March, was it March of 2020 last year, that Predictive was finally taken down. So out of that, we filed multiple public records requests similar to Freedom of Information Acts, demanding information from LAPD to expose how these programs worked. They were called predictive policing programs because they utilized algorithms and risk assessments to predict who and where crime would happen, right? And we all saw this as just a facade, a way for them to use pseudoscience to justify the targeting of people and community. So we were actually able to obtain what were called mission sheets that were handed out to patrol officers, some specialty patrol officers. I'm sure folks have heard of the Metro division within LAPD to hunt down people in the community, particularly targeting the South Bureau, which housed which encompasses 77th Division, Southeast and Southwest Division. Operation Laser was particularly deadly in that area, killing a lot of youth during its first launch in 2016. So we were able to get those maps, and we got laser zone maps, and we also were able to obtain Predictive hotspot maps. And so we started to analyze these Predictive hotspots and laser zones. And a lot of the talk in 2016 about predictive policing was that there was just a ratchet effect, right? That it was just about a feedback loop, that the data coming in, which was crime data, was just going to draw police back to the same communities. And on face value, yes, that is very much what was happening. But as we started to analyze these maps, we saw that something more was going on. We realized that there was a correlation to containment, to not only containing certain areas, but then also targeting certain areas for gentrification. And Tiff will be, and I'll let Tiff introduce themselves in just a moment, will be taking us through some of those maps, so that makes a little more sense. So on Mondays, the very first Monday of the month, this working group meets to analyze those maps. And we have built an analysis around looking at the intersection of real estate development, city official partnership with real estate and Los Angeles Police Department to banish, I would say, to target certain areas for banishment through the use of predictive policing. And so when we think about this, this is through the use of data-driven technologies, right? Collecting data, using various tools to analyze this data, and creating programs to banish people through the targeting of people, through the targeting of spaces, and down to the targeting of homes that they want to remove people from, right? So this Land and Policing Working Group meets the first Monday of every month at 6 p.m. Our next meeting, I believe, is next month, or no, it's not next, it's the next week is the 31st. It's Memorial Day. But so the first, I think it's, when is it? I don't know. Anyways, so the first Monday at 6 p.m. So if you're interested, again, in land and policing, that's when we're meeting. So like I said, it didn't end with PredPol and Operation Laser. As we exposed these programs, we fought back against them. LAPD does what policing do, and they reformed themselves. And they created a new program called, thanks, Steve. So it's June 7th is the first Monday of the month. And so that's when we'll be meeting for land and policing. So the third Monday of the month, the Data Informed Community Focused Policing Group meets. And this is a fight to dismantle this program. So LAPD saw, like, okay, they exposed Laser, they exposed PredPol, they demonstrated that these programs were operating arbitrarily, that they were criminalizing particularly Black folks, removing Black people from their communities, evicting them from their homes. So they developed that program called Data Informed Community Focused Policing. And so this group needs to look at how was PredPol and Operation Laser reformed? What is this new programming that is utilizing location-based policing, person-based policing, community policing to basically contain, control, and criminalize? Because a lot of the same tactics still exist, they're just named differently. And we'll go through that in, oh, actually, I'm going to show you something right now to talk about it. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to bring up what I am talking about. Okay, so I called it Data Informed Community Focused Policing. And I want to give a shout out to Amira, to Sabrina, to Tiff for spending a lot of time working on helping us create a popular education tool to explain and to demonstrate to community how surveillance tactics and community policing come together to control communities, right? And why it's important for us to understand what data mining is, what behavioral surveillance is, what analytical programs like Palantir are, and what warehouses like fusion centers are that warehouse information. So I'm going to quickly take us through this. And on the left-hand side, you'll see number one, and this is all based on programming that LAPD calls the SARA model, right? And so it starts with scanning, which we call spying and surveillance, where, and you look in this community, you can see that there's helicopters, right? And we know that helicopters work in conjunction with predictive policing, with data-driven policing, hovering over hotspot areas, right? Areas that LAPD says are crime-ridden. You see over here the closed circuit television cameras, and we know that LAPD has programs where they're encouraging business owners and homeowners through other programs like Ring technology to send their data to LAPD. Over here, you have a drone, right? We know that drones are being used to monitor crowds. We know they're being used to monitor high threat situations from LAPD. We know that they're picking up data all through the community, and we fought very hard against those programs. Down here, you see, I believe, what is a shot spotter, right? Picking up sound, not only sounds of like possible gunfire, but voices and communications and discussions through the community. Over here, so this kind of is giving us the image of our community and how LAPD starts to infiltrate not only with technology, but also we see with their presence of patrolling, with their presence of foot patrolling in any kind of way they categorize it, whether it's walking our kids to school, they say safely, whether it's playing football with our kids, whether it's being on foot beats right through downtown, they infiltrate our community. The second number two up on top is what they call the analysis, but we call the targeting and the criminalization of our community. And this is where they take all that data that they've gathered of the community and they start to use it to justify, right? They start to build their story. And often I say the collection of data is the de-aggregation of who we are as people. It's breaking us down to data points. And then the analysis is the re-aggregation of that data through the lens of criminality, right? So they take that information and they start to build their justification for why they need to be there, why they need to target us, why they have to target certain homes, why certain areas need more police presence. But in order to do that, they need warehouses where they keep this data. They need analytical tools that analyze this data, that gather this data. So up here, you'll see to the right here, you see the Joint Regional Intelligence Center. And this are called fusion centers. And LAPD sends some of their information to fusion centers. Now, fusion centers are national, and LAPD always tries to say, oh, well, you know, that's a national program. We're not really involved. But we know that post 9/11 and under the Intelligence Reform Terrorism Prevention Act, the encouragement was to share data, to share information horizontally, laterally, through all forms of law enforcement so that they could get the eyes and the ears and collect all that data and preempt, right, terrorism. But what we know is that this is just the justification for them to continue to gather information to further criminalize our communities. So here you'll see this little symbol, and this is the Palantir symbol, right? Because they need an analytical tool to be able to mine all that data and bring it together. LAPD also has something, so moving out of the fusion center, you see that LAPD also has something called the records management system. And in the records management system is where LAPD stores a lot of the data they collect locally. So I'm going to end right now by talking about two last things, and I'm going to pass it to Tiff. But here you see something that's called the Community Safety Operations Centers. And this is what we like to call mini fusion centers, right? These little mini fusion centers exist per bureau. So there's 4 in LAPD's, in all of the LA city. And this is again where they're collecting and holding data. But LAPD went a step further under this new program called Data Informed Community Focused Policing and created area crime community intelligence centers. And these data warehousing centers where they collect data, where they analyze the data, and they decide who they're going to target are located per area. So there are 21 of these through the city, throughout the entire city of Los Angeles. And this is where they basically do their response and their assessment, how they come up with their missions, their patrols, their different programs of how they're going to target our community. So I'm going to stop right there, but this is just all in it's being developed. So again, if you want to participate in taking down this program, this working group meets on the 3rd Monday at 6 p.m. of the month. Just drop your email in the chat or email Stop LAPD Spying, and we can loop you into those working groups. But I'm going to pass to my comrade Tiff, and we're going to share a little bit of those mission sheets that, and I'm going to pop it up right now, Tiff, okay, of Central Division, particularly because we're going to be bringing in the community of Skid Row to talk a little bit about policing in Skid Row. So we thought we'd start with showing some of the Predpol hotspots and the mission sheets that were developed for, anchor points and laser zones and stuff that were developed for Central Division, which is where Skid Row is at. So I'm going to pass it to you, Tiff, and get that PowerPoint up.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiff, or T. Guerra. My pronouns are they and them. I'm with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and part of the group that has been looking at data-driven policing here in LA, and been part of that fight to dismantle, defund, and abolish these systems of surveillance, and have been part of that fight since about 2017. And so what Jamie has just been describing is some of those data-driven programs that we've been fighting. And so now we'll look at some of those maps. And yeah, if you want to take us to that first map, Jamie, of the anchor points. So this shows us, and these were some of the maps that were obtained in the PRAs filed by the coalition. So this shows us where the anchor points were for Skid Row in 2018. And again, regarding anchor points, so these are locations that LAPD, the story that LAPD gave was that these were crime attractors, and they were supposed to be determined by calculations based on reports of crime, but really there was never any clear indication or evidence that there was actual any calculation. What was clear was that LAPD was selecting those locations themselves, and that they were targeting them for heavier patrol, heavier surveillance, and doing that under the guise of it being data-driven policing. As we take a closer look at some of these anchor points, what we see is that some of them, or many of them, are actually the locations, and you'll see that a couple are circled there, of low-income housing units, and for SROs, which are single residency occupancy hotels. And these are hotels that provide housing to low-income folks. And so like at what we see circled is the intersection of Spring and 5th, and also Maple and 7th Street. And these are locations where affordable housing has existed or does exist now, and also intersections that have been targeted for redevelopment and for the building of lofts and for high-rise apartment buildings that displace that low-income housing. So again, those are the anchor points, the locations that LAPD decided needed more surveillance and more disruption. The slide that we're looking at now, so this is looking at a map of the Predpol hotspots, and this map was generated by a coalition member or by coalition folks who, once we got the location of Predpol hotspots from 2015. And what we're looking at is, what we see is how the hotspots for Predpol, they're essentially creating a divide between Skid Row and the surrounding community. Because on this map that we're looking at, Skid Row is the area to the right of that dense cluster of hotspots. And that line, that very dense line of hotspots, is where the business district is. And we see how with reports of crime and by using Predpol, LAPD justifies the policing of this divide, essentially keeping people contained in that Skid Row area. And if we look at the next map, so previously we were looking at the 2015 hotspots. Now we're looking at the 2018 hotspots. And again, we see this space where the Skid Row community is, and the hotspots are around the edges. And then now we are looking at, so this is another look at those anchor points that we were looking at a moment ago. And keeping these in mind, what we're looking at now is those anchor points are now those red dots, and we're seeing them situated in that wider landscape that includes Predpol hotspots. And what we see here is how Predpol is creating the containment of Skid Row, and then the anchor points are justifying the surveillance and policing of specific locations that are within Skid Row and around the edges of the community of Skid Row. So we have policing around the edges, and then also the abuse of people at those anchor points within. And then I think not sure if we have another slide to look at or not, Jamie.
I think that's the last one. And then I was going to switch over to the laser zones in. So I'm going to move. Is that okay, Tiff? That I'm going to move into this next one so we keep us close on time, because I think I was a little bit of a chatterbox in the beginning.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Thank you, Tiff. And so picking up where Tiff left off and started kind of moving us into the conversation around Skid Row is where Tiff was showing everybody, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit on this map. And this is a map of basically of the heart of Skid Row. This is San Pedro right here. And you'll see the street San Pedro right there. And so what Tiff was showing you was anchor points that were coming down right on 5th and San Pedro right here. Wait, here. This was where one of the last anchor points was here, and then 7th and Maple, which is here where you saw the other ones, just so you can kind of resituate yourself. But the reason why I'm showing this now, because remember how I said, and we were talking about laser zones and anchor points, and those were all a part of Operation Laser, right? All these names and acronyms, right? But as we saw with the density maps of the hotspots, and we're trying to bring these all together into one map eventually. What Tiff was showing you was there was a containment area where Predpol was kind of up over here, in this area up here, kind of creating a very distinctive line. It was right along Los Angeles Street that line was, for those of you who are familiar with downtown. And then the laser zones were like, so you think about Predpol operating one way, and then laser coming in and encroaching into the heart of Skid Row. And in 2018, at the heart of Skid Row, laser targeted the heart of Skid Row in 2018. But because we were able to dismantle that program, they never created mission sheets for that program. But at the same time, in 2018, the 2040 plan was announced for downtown. And in the 2040 plan, there was a plan to rezone Skid Row. And the particular dividing line where they were going to rezone Skid Row was right along San Pedro, right here. So what you see is the dividing line that's protecting the new gentrifying area of downtown, right? And then all of a sudden you see laser coming in to encroach on Skid Row, where there's a whole community that's set up. And that's what we're going to talk about right now, because there is a community that's down there that's living, right? And they particularly on this new dividing line, they declared war by deciding that laser zones were going to be set up right there for the targeting and the hyper policing or the policing of that area. I'm sorry, I hate that word, hyper policing. It's just the policing of the area. But there's a whole history there already, right? Laser isn't something new, and the policing of that area isn't something new, and the containment of that area isn't something new, and the attempt to banish people or disappear people from that area isn't something new. So I wanted to invite Brother Pancake, General Dogon, and Steve Diaz from the Los Angeles Community Action Network to talk to us a little bit about the containing, the controlling, and the criminalization and the banishment of the community of Skid Row. And I wanted to first invite Brother Pancake to unmute his mic, and I wanted to welcome you, Pancake. I wanted to welcome you here. You've been such a huge part of the fight against Predictive Policing 1.0. You've meant the world to us in doing that and to encouraging this group. So I want to spend this time just asking you to introduce yourself to the community. And I wanted to also ask you, after you do that, if you can tell us a little bit about how long you've lived in downtown and how you have seen downtown Los Angeles change. So take it away, Brother Pancake.
Yes, I'll start from the beginning. Is that all right? My name is Pancake, member of LACAN, Stop LAPD Spying. We are a community organizer, and we're grassroots on the ground. I'm on the ground. I can see 10, downtown LA, Skid Row. And, first of all, I'd like to say that Skid Row is a community. You know, you may address, say, oh, I live on Skid Row. No, to be properly termed as you live in Skid Row. I've met some of the most beautiful people here in downtown LA, Skid Row, so many gifted folks that's fallen on hard times. And the challenges that they face and being evicted, you know, certain communities, they stay to the inner city and they have been disadvantaged as such for whatever reasons, you know, and they find themselves in row. And the lack of service of the whole system, it's like failed a lot of the folks on Skid Row, you know, the criminal justice system. And, you know, we've been through how many police since we had Gates, Williams, old broken windows, Bratton, Parks, Beck, now Michael Moore, you know, and like the uprising with Rodney King, can't we all get along? But I look at the system of policing, you know, here in Skid Row. Skid Row, they're trying to contain and box us all in where, you know, east of Maine, how folks have been neglected. And, you know, during the gentrification period, you know, I like to say that Los Angeles have been, but downtown LA, they should have renamed it Los Angeles. Los Angeles. You know, when the gentrification period and digitalized folk, they moved in for a minute, they saw it wasn't working. It wasn't working because, you know, we have to coexist. We have to coexist. You know, you look at the lack of affordable housing, the lack of intervention services, you know, folk, they need help. They have issues, emotional issues. You know, they've been, it's just become disconnected. They have issues that need to be solved. You know, not only physical, you know, we look at the abuses of, you know, I'm getting to the point where the women, houseless women on Skid Row, and I'm seeing police really dehumanizing and verbally, and I've documented and I've recorded it, and it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable, and these are things that I'm putting out there, you know, as far as really how policing on Skid Row and the language that come out of some of the cops, you know, mouths that very damaging to folk, stepping on folk with their language. And my heart goes out to this community. You know, I've come to the park, being part of, I'm not gonna take you being part of Stop LAPD, and, you know, I wanna applaud all the work that has gone on within the Stop LAPD spine and exposing the system for what really is. You know, we came in, you know, fusion centers, the Pope came in, trying to jump things, and now they're fusion centers, SARS, you know, now come point, well, you know, but the reports before his somebody talking about from predictive policing to precision policing. And it's up to us to see where we are now. There are holes. And what do we say to data-driven policing? Shut it down.
Shut it down.
It's not working. We need services, not more police. And I'm very passionate about what I say because I'm getting ready to cry. It's affecting lives. Human. And that's on the cops in this area, down on Skid Row. You know, I go into other areas, but since we're here, you know, on Skid Row, you know, it has to end. It has to end with these cops here. You know, they really need a crash course in sensitivity training. I'm serious. We were on Sunday when Brother Africa was killed. We were coming from somewhere. I said, what's going on? What's going on? The jury shop, the jury shop that I used to work to help out in, Brother Charlie used to come in. He would act normal and say, Africa, how you doing? You know, boom, 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 so forth and so on. But that could have, look at that was smart team and Martinez, big old Martinez, you know, on now, of course, you know, if you use a taser, how many volts are going throughout your body? You know, you have muscular reactions, right, Jamie? He was like this. Very sad what happened when Brother Africa was killed. Very sad on that day. So anyway, I want to just, those are pieces out there you can connect, you know, just to kind of sum it up, you know, and evolution. It's about people, and, you know, these systems must be dismantled, abolished, shut it down. Thank you very much, James.
Awesome. Thank you, Pancake. Pancake is one of our strongest community kind of de-escalators. I've seen Pancake be able to intervene and keep us safe. And I just want to thank you so much for that work, Pancake. There's been so many times that you've just shown love when that's what people need, when they're in those moments of crisis, and you have done the work that needs to be done, that our community needs. And I really, you know, appreciate you so much, so much.
Thank you.
I want to turn now to General Dogon. I have a question for you, General Dogon. I would like you to also introduce yourself to the community, a little bit about who you are, your work at LA CAN. But I'd like for you, Dogon, to break down for us also what are the multiple forms of police interaction that a person who lives in Skid Row experiences in a day. So I know you're involved in Community Watch, and so I want to see if I can tap you into that question. And
yeah, for sure. So can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, cool. So good evening, everybody. My name is General Dogon. I'm a people's organizer. I'm also an organizer around human and civil rights here at LA CAN on Skid Row. And I'm also the point man on our community watch team that go out and monitor and document interactions between law enforcement, private security guards like the Business Improvement District, the BIDS, and Skid Row residents for the last 16 years at LA CAN. I'm born and raised on Skid Row. My parents met on Skid Row back in the 50s. They fell in love. I was born 9 months later in General Hospital, grew up downtown. When I got in my addiction in the 80s, in the 92, I was sent to California State Prison for over a decade. When I got back downtown, when I came home, I came, of course, to Skid Row. And Skid Row was a whole new downtown. Downtown was a whole new city. You had dogs being walked by folks, dog shit all over the place. I ain't never seen that. Starbucks. You know, I remember downtown was, you know, like a Las Vegas when I was a kid. It was a place for everybody. You had all multiple colors, rich people, white folks, everybody dancing, partying, the nightclubs, the ballrooms, the theaters that was on Broadway, Spring Street, around about. You know, downtown was a party 24/7. And when I got out of prison, everything was just changed. Skid Row was hell of a tents there. I couldn't understand where all those tents that came from. Policing, was on steroids. They had private security guards riding on bicycles, harassing community residents. And so I quickly joined the fight at LA Can around 2005. Around 2006, around 2005, we created our community watch team and we took it to the streets. And we had successfully monitored and documented the business improvement district, private security guards that was harassing homeless people. Just like Jamie was saying, Skid Row was created as a containment zone. You know, it's the largest rehabilitation community in the nation. And it ain't by coincidence that all the missions, all the shelters, all the rehab programs, right, and all the poor folks, you know what I'm saying, is all smashed into one little 50, they say it's a 50 block area, but where all the institutions, service providers I just talked about, or all that was in about a 15 block area. And it ain't by coincidence that all these buildings just came together, you know, like a magnet. No, this is by design. The city created Skid Row, created this containment zone to house its disfavorable citizens in the city. To say, you ain't gotta go nowhere. You need a bed, we got you. You hungry, we got you. You need some clothes, whatever you need, we got you. Don't go nowhere, stay right here, right? And police, you know, it's been used always, right? Always to control. They trying to turn Skid Row into a prison camp where it's just, you got nothing but just cameras all over the place. What's crazy about it is the business improvement district. These are citizens just like you and I, right? This is the business community donated 72 cameras to LAPD to put around Skid Row so that they can watch community residents, right? This is on top of their oppressive private security guards that ride around on bicycles that some communities say are worse than the police because they want to be, right? And then just about time that we got the business improvement district under control, around 2006, the city pissed off because they was dinged in federal court, right, for a lawsuit called Jones versus the city of Los Angeles, in which the city was found guilty in federal court for 8th Amendment cruel and unusual punishment for the way they treated homeless people in this city. And they was forced to make amends. The amends was they would allow homeless people to sleep on the streets from 9 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning until the city built 1,200 units of permanent support housing to get people off the street. Instead of the city turning around and saying, you know what, this is a fine time for us to start building housing. We're gonna throw the handcuffs away and we're gonna focus on house keys. This was the best time for them to start doing that. Instead of them doing that, they did the worst thing you could do. They tried to police their way out of homelessness, tried to police their way out of every situation. And they created what they call a Safer Cities Initiative, which was it's a form of policing that's born out of the broken windows theory of policing, right? And it was launched on Skid Row 2006. Chief Braden, who gentrified Times Square so good, they just knew he could come to Skid Row and do the same thing downtown. And they had a 6-month plan, you know, basically to just, you know, push everybody into shelters, push everybody into drug programs and stuff like that, and just basically just contain the whole area, you know what I'm saying? More than what it was already being contained. So they brought 110 extra police to Skid Row, right? And it constituted the largest deployment of policing in the nation, in America, and it was second in the world to Baghdad. The only reason why Baghdad had more cops in the streets than Skid Row is because Baghdad was at war at the time and the military was in the streets. But it was the largest occupation in the city's history. You know, just the first year of the initiative, just in a 15 block area, they had made over 11,000 arrests and wrote 13,000 citations to a community of roughly around 13 residents. The first 3 years of the initiative, they had arrested over 27,000 people and had wrote over 36,000 tickets, just like I say, to a community of 13,000 residents. And you say, how the hell, you know what I mean, do you arrest 27,000 people where you ain't got but 13,000 to start with, by repeatedly harassing and arresting people over and over and over and over again. The most arrested person on Skid Row was a woman named Ann Moody. She was arrested for no other reason than having nowhere to go, right? Sitting on the sidewalk. And because she was sitting on sidewalk, you know what I mean? And they said she was shelter resistant when they go in, she was arrested. And so I could sit here and talk all day. You know, the new year talks about some of the do-low dirty tactics that LAPD use. Sit a homeless person or just a resident walking in the community, because a lot of people think that Skid Row is just a homeless community. You know, you got more house people than you have homeless people in the community. And people, the occupation was so strong. And where I was living at in the Sanborn Hotel, I walked coming home from work one day, and it was 4 residents in the hallway drawing straws. And I was like, what the hell are y'all doing? Y'all just playing? They said, no, we serious. They were drawing straws to see who's gonna make the store run. Because going to the store, you ain't guaranteed to come back. It's like Vietnam. You leave the house and never come back, right? People was being arrested, set up, and going to jail whole extensive amount of times, right? To whereas your housing unit was saying, the hotel was saying, oh, you abandoned your unit, right? And so they was evicting people. People was losing their homes. People was losing their jobs. Just walking through the community, they had a horseback. They had cops on horses that was running around on Skid Row. So you could be sitting on the corner walking by 1 minute, the horses will pass you by. They have another unit called Eastside Detail, which is a bicycle unit. About 12 cops that just rolled up on bicycles and jack everybody in the vicinity. Then they had a DIP task force. They call themselves Drinking in Public Task Force, where they used to go around, they catch you with a beer or anything, you know what I mean? They jump out on you, throw you against the wall, handcuff you, search you, run your name, and for warrants and warrants, like you public enemy number 1, you standing up against the wall for like 45 minutes, right? Then they just write you a ticket, disrespect you, you know what I mean? And so they had them, they had Jump Out, right? The community called Jump Out, the community named the pigs Jump Out because it was an undercover buy and bust team. They had a undercover pig that would walk around the community. Now, let me remind you that this is a drug rehab community, right? We have some people that's actively in their addiction, and you got some people that's in their recovery. But nevertheless, the LAPD was making a, excuse me, they was making drug arrests on Skid Row, and the majority of their drug arrests was for 0.1 grams. That's dust, that's nothing, that's crumbs in a pipe, right? And they was railroading people, giving them no plea deals, sending them straight to the penitentiary, right? Everybody that was arrested in the Skid Row corridor wasn't given no plea deals. These Jump Out police cops, they would send one cop would be walking around and he would see somebody in their addiction and he would see them with, you know, maybe $5 worth of stuff in their hand, and he'll offer them a ridiculous amount of money for what they got in their hand. Of course, they're gonna give it to you because they're in their addiction, you know. So when they would give them the stuff, the cops would arrest them for possession of sales, right? Overriding the fact that they are addicts and they need to go to a drug program. They would railroad folks that arrested on Skid Row as drug dealers and railroad them to the penitentiary as drug dealers, right? And these so after the person would buy it, you know, the undercover would walk away and he would walk in his, he would whisper in his shirt, give the guy descriptions. Then about 7, 8 cars would pull up on the guy, and about 12 police would jump out the car and start running right to you, and they would tackle you like it's the last play of the game in the Super Bowl and you got the ball, right? And you talking about 12 police, every police got a different body part. So they twisting you up like Stretch Armstrong, right? And so it was a use of force, you know what I'm saying, on almost all of the incidents that the cops was responding to, because anytime you get that many cops that's patrolling one area, it becomes an overuse of force when they respond. right? Which add and leads up to assaults on people. And if you touch the cop, you know, you don't get assault on one of them, they give you assault on 12 of them. So you end up catching the case with, you know, for possession plus 12 counts of assault. And so just like I was saying, I could sit here and talk all day about the Dulo dirty tricks. But the last thing I want to say is that the policing was so crazy on Skid Row that Central Division, which is the most powerful LAPD division they have, it's the only division that don't have house prisoners because of the weapons they have inside. They won the meanest city award for the worstest police station in America. The National Law Center on Homeless and Poverty, every year they do a meanest city report, right? They research the worstest police station in America. Right?
Wow.
And not only did Central Division won the award, but they broke all previous records from all previous winners. So they became the all-time fucking worstest, meanest. And so to be the meanest in LA, meaning you the worstest, you worse than the police stations in Alabama, you worse than the police stations in Mississippi, you worse than the police stations all down south. So that's what we dealing with. LA is the most racist city west of the Mississippi. And it's because she leads the nation in homelessness, she leads the nation in police brutality, she leads the nation in incarceration, and everything else that's fucked up. So
and General,
I'm gonna stop right there because I could talk all to New Year's.
Yeah, General Dogon, this is Tiff. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your experiences. And we would love to keep listening to you. And thank you so much for joining us. We do have a question though. We're also joined tonight by Steve Diaz, who's a longtime organizer with the Los Angeles Community Action Network. And we're really glad to have Steve with us as well. And Steve, I would love to now invite you to introduce yourself and perhaps tell us a little bit more about the history of the containment plan and what is in the 2040 plan with regard to Skid Row.
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm Steve. Let me turn on my camera and not be rude. Dogon's definitely a hard act to follow, so it's a high standard. Just a couple things I'll add to the conversation that are missing. I think one, it's important to just know land, policing, data, homelessness, and gentrification all go hand in hand. So they all sort of play a role in sort of how communities are controlled and how people are forcefully removed or occupied. And I think that's a really important sort of point to sort of point out. When Dogon talked about the sort of containment plan, that whole plan will sort of keep people concentrated in a certain area because we don't want these folks to interact with the folks that we're trying to bring to the financial district and to Bunker Hill. So it was all about sort of how do we use land policies, how do we use policing sort of to keep folks in a certain area, limit interaction, and at the same time, sort of say that we're doing a good. So oftentimes you'll hear people argue about, well, it was a containment plan that was not good, but there was also a benefit of it in that it allowed for the upgrading and rehabilitation of numerous residential hotels that are still covenanted through an affordable housing covenant that usually lasts anywhere between 55 years and longer, depending on who sort of operates them and sort of the wishes of the operator in terms of serving the mission of the community. That's one. I think the other piece that's super important is to sort of know downtown historically has been used as a space where land and policing have sort of gone hand in hand, whether it be sort of in the new buildings that are being gentrified or proposed for to support the gentrification effort, to sort of how some of the older buildings that are located in downtown have a policing presence. We were actually organizing against a building that was being proposed to be converted, called the Old Salvation Army building, and it was a building that historically had served the community benefit. And one of the things that we found out when we found out about the new developer was A, it was unaffordable, but B, they were actually required to do a walkthrough with the senior lead officer of the area to discuss around placement of cameras. So Dogon talked about cameras and sort of camera donations, right? So you can't just sort of have one without the other, without the level of coordination. And sort of that level of data collection and sort of coordination then also sort of leads to the resource allocation. So when you hear about like sort of the Safer Cities initiative, you hear about, that was all about resource allocation and how do we sort of occupy a space that could not be gentrified by our policies and by our friends in City Hall, so that now we can sort of start getting people to be put away and stay away orders and so on to ensure that people, community gets shrunker. And when as it shrinks, excuse me, not shrunker, there's less space for people to be able to sort of access. And that's sort of what's the case right now in the DTLA 2040 plan. So the DTLA 2040 plan is sort of a community plan. And community plans basically have two key components. They have a policy and programs piece, which are basically the ideas and sort of the big fluff stuff around how do we want to see a community grow or what do we want to see brought to a community. And then there's the zoning recommendations. And the zoning recommendations really talk about what can be done in a certain area or a certain space. Community plans, there's about 35 of them in the city of LA and are sort of geographically focused. And the downtown one, what they're proposing for the Skid Row area is an area that was originally focused to create and have sustainable, affordable housing, now is being shrunk to ensure that affordable housing for folks that live there can only be built in an extremely smaller area. What once was anywhere between a 50 to 55 block square area by definition, either in the 70s or even a smaller area in the lawsuit versus Jones versus the city of LA, has now got shrunker even less. So it shrinks almost 65% from what it was originally laid out as. And this is important, right? Because as you're shrinking the space for access, you're deploying these sort of police resources that are being talked about that Jamie and Tiffany laid out. These police resources aren't just being put out there as a method of sort of just wasting resources. They're there to sort of keep the people away from that other space that the land use policies have been used to gentrify is one. And they're also there to appease sort of the new folks that are there to have them feel safer or sort of have a sense of safety because they believe that police patrols are a good thing. For example, on Broadway, a place that for folks who are from LA know that historically you would be able to go shopping, sort of have that communal sense. The new downtowners who lived in the new converted properties did not feel safe. And they actually advocated to then Councilmember Weezar and had a whole political campaign around it to ensure that there was 35 additional police officers for a period of time deployed. And those 35 police officers did absolutely nothing but walk in teams of 3 up and down Broadway, basically scaring people out and making people not feel safe, Broadway and Spring. So if there's anything that folks sort of take from the small piece that I added to this conversation is it's all connected. One can't happen without the other. All of this is sort of led by greed and the idea that people have or should have the privilege to access land that was never traditionally theirs, and that they will get rid of whoever is there by any means necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, Pancake, and General Dogon. That was really amazing. And I want to open us up for questions and comments, but I know that one of our other comrades needs to get off the webinar, but they want to share a poem. And I think right now a poem would be nice. And then we'll take just and if you have any questions or you want any kind of comment, please start putting them in the chat. We'll listen to this poem, kind of just check in real quick, and then we're going to transition this conversation overseas and into Palestine.
Thank you, family, friends. I see you. It's good to see a lot of folks. Pancake, Steve, General Dogon. It's good to hear you all. So as I was listening, I was also writing and inspired to finish a poem I started today in preparation for tonight. It's a little poem for what we're sharing, and then I have to log out to help plan an action that everyone's invited to in Long Beach, June 6, 10 a.m., where there are children being contained and detained, and that's what we're also talking about here. So I just want to plug that in, and you will hear more about it. The deadly exchange. What is a deadly exchange but a pact between evils, a trade in tactics that kill, between forces that steal sacred life and land, extracted, exploited, contained, contaminated, raped, tortured, surveilled, devastated, and still we prevail because we know about these war games. The scars are on our ancestral bodies. The trauma is in our tissue and memories, and the resistance is in both and more. Our spirits are protected, armed to fight back and share medicines, rituals, songs, prayers, dances, underground connections, organizing tactics to disrupt and end this deadly exchange between police forces from Skid Row to Baghdad, East LA to the West Bank, Colombia to Palestine. You name it, they exchanged it. Recipes to murder Black and brown indigenous babies all over the globe, from the womb to their walk to school, from the classroom to the county hospital to the jail, from the made up borders and walls to the juvenile halls. We call for an end to all the legacies and lies of white supremacy and all its ties. As they exchange against all life, we double down on sharing love and life. That is all for now. Thank you. Thanks for the space, y'all. Much love and power to us. Hope this inspires us to keep channeling the rage and the power that we have to create something better right now, and tomorrow. Thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you so much, Mariela. Thank
You're
you
welcome.
so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for holding this space and all these powers together. Peace, y'all. Thanks for the folks who are about to speak. I wish I'll catch you in the recording. Bye-bye.
So before we transition, I wanted to see, was there anything in the chat? Was there anything, questions that Steve, General Dogon, or for Pancake? If not, I'm going to pass it to Shakir, but I want to hold that moment for just a second. Or any comments from anybody?
There was just one previous comment around collecting data on Skid Row residents, and when I gotta scroll it up, it was about collecting data on Skid Row residents and how do folks think that that gets used.
Dogon, Pancake, or Steve?
I mean, most definitely there's data collection. There's always been data collection. They doing the same data collection that they doing in other parts of the city. You know, particularly some of the outreach teams. Every time you go to one of the service providers, you know, first thing they do is collect your information, right? And so there's data being collected. The problem is, I mean, yeah, there's data from all over the place around about Skid Row, but the problem is they know, you know, about the poverty situation, but nothing is never reinvested into it. All the data collection is always used to criminalize us further and further, right? And to justify, you know what I'm saying, for what they do. And so, I mean, that's what the data is being used for, because when you look at the conditions, Skid Row been the same way, you know what I mean, for the last 20, 30 years, right? You know, since I've been, you know, been out of here, you know, really focusing and looking at the homeless crisis. Skid Row haven't changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. So what are they doing with the data collection?
Yeah, I would just add quickly to that. The honest opinion is all kinds of things with the data collection in terms of interpretation. everything from not doing anything with it to trying to shut down properties that have large amounts of 911 calls around it, not at it, to deployment of police resources and sort of how they get deployed to what corner, what street, to creating information bulletins and a lot of the data that's talked about and how the corners and intersections that Jamie and Tiff talked about that were created. So it's any and everything. But I think for me, the most important point is not necessarily that how, but all the misinterpretation of how it's being used is probably one of the most important things, because they're basing it on their biased judgment and taking their opinion of business interests, not of actual people that are living, breathing, and being impacted every day.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all again so much for joining. And I'm going to pass it now to Shakir, and thank you all for waiting, our other guests, and I look forward to hearing this second half. And so thank you so much again for waiting and for listening to our stories here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing and for for really teaching us so much about how when we talk about these data technologies and other technologies of war that LAPD is using to, like Brother Pancake was saying, to contain, to kind of even like besiege, to control, and just manage, and like General Dogon said, like occupied land in Skid Row. I'm really grateful to be able to hear kind of both the kind of personal individual stakes of that, as well as the history and kind of how that regime of containment, like you were describing, Steve, has changed over time. So yeah, in our data-driven policing work group, we've been looking at how policing is used and its role in particularly displacement and gentrification and dispossession, including through collaborations between police and developers, between municipal prosecutors, between kind of all of these agencies, between business improvement districts, like General Dogon was talking about, and kind of the broader the tools that police use for this stuff, as well as kind of the ideologies and the methods that drive all of this. And so in that discussion, as we've been meeting and talking as a group, we started just kind of as we've been seeing what's happening in Gaza this past couple weeks, and always have understood the connections between the ways that Skid Row is policed, and like General Dogon was saying, it's comparable, like the next closest thing is the occupation of Iraq and the policing and military kind of rule in Baghdad is thinking. So we've always been kind of sensitive to those connections, but seeing kind of the technologies that are being used by Israel and in the occupation and siege and this past month the bombardment and massacres in Gaza and really in particular, actually last Sunday, a week before this week, we kind of noticed direct connections between, even in actually in a news article in the Washington Post, connecting what had happened that morning, which was that the Israeli military had killed in a single night 21 members of the same family, the El Kulak family. And I was kind of watching this closely because they were all relatives of a friend of mine here, and seeing actually, and so the Washington Post even reported as that operation was the first test of this new kind of strategy of warfare that the Israeli military, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces had kind of declared as their kind of new paradigm of warfare, called their victory strategy. And as we kind of started to dive into that, we saw, it's very much framed around how they're going to be using all this surveillance technology, all this data mining, all this autonomous kind of technology, like, which is basically, like drones and automated technologies that we're going to get into via a couple of our guests here. We have Jesse, Craig, and Leah, who have all worked in different capacities in the Deadly Exchange program or the campaign to kind of tackle the direct kind of training and material links between police forces in the U.S., including LAPD and IDF. So we've seen that exchange happen in those ways. We're going to get into that in more detail. But first, this particular kind of new paradigm of warfare and occupation and kind of, just violence in an occupied territory. So yeah, we started kind of researching that, and Amira has been looking really closely at that. Amira, who's a part of our data-driven policing work group, as well as does a lot of other work with the coalition. So Amira, if you just want to kind of introduce that and just to frame these connections between data-driven warfare and what everyone's been sharing about Skid Row so far.
Yeah, sure. And I would just thank you, Amira Jarmakani, she, hers. And I would just add to Gaza the ongoing violence and occupation and actively occupying of parts of Jerusalem and other parts of the West Bank as well, Sheikh Jarrah and others, but also within Al-Aqsa, which Israel is literally calling a law and order response in relation to that right now. So just wanted to name law and order and the crossover there as well in terms of direct occupation. But in terms of Gaza, we were thinking about, in looking at this sort of description of the victory strategy, or I've forgotten actually what it was called now. Part of the language in there is this language of multi-domain. So I'm going to put some of these things into the chat as well. And that language of multi-domain strategy, it basically talks about a principle of combining air, ground, and sea forces militarily, which is not really that surprising, right? It sounds like typical kind of military strategy talk. But what this one in specific also does is combine that with a kind of link to data in a very particular way. And so it also names electronic, cyber, and other strike capabilities. And then it names the capabilities or the desire to do this through specifically advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. So, and they name that as ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So I think what's interesting about this is that sort of using the usual military language of air, ground, and sea to really be packing in this kind of data focus. And it's not just data, of course, right? It's also particular kind of integration of the technologies, including a whole range of things that we've just been hearing about and talking about in relation to LAPD capabilities. So part of what this document also names, I mean, some of it is just the language of smart policing or smart, warfare, which tends to name these kinds of technologies like, well, we're getting more precise at it, we're getting better at it, and so we call it smart, right? But we really mean like all of these data related technologies. But what was interesting is that it's also linked to this idea of the fourth industrial revolution. And so it seems to be what that is referring to is some, I wasn't familiar with it before, but it seems to be naming this idea of if the third industrial revolution is about the move to the digital. So incorporating these kinds of technologies that we've been talking about here, better surveillance and those sort of things. The fourth industrial revolution refers to velocity, scope, and impact of the digital and the integration of it. So it's like this hyper integration and the speed and the ability to sort of use these kinds of technologies in all these sorts of ways. So again, just thinking about all of that in relation to literal bombing and airstrikes that we were seeing on Gaza, part of what this this document, I think, invites us to think about also is the relationship between military airstrikes, literal airstrikes, and aerial surveillance. So if we think about a kind of move toward air, the use of air in relation to military strategy, it was even in before World War II, but moving into World War II and then coming out of World War II, it was very much linked to the ability to see and the ability to surveil. So I think this is part of what would be helpful for us to think about in terms of this kind of strategy. The thinking about drones and thinking about things like trap wire, other kinds of cameras that are mounted as part of this kind of like air surveillance strategy as well. So I think I'll just sort of, there are a lot more things that we could say, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just sort of leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mira. And yeah, let's come back to some of that. But I want to connect even, let's just even kind of just begin with the connections to LAPD. I want to start with Craig. I know you have to leave soon. So yeah, can you just talk about kind of the Deadly Exchange campaign, and in particular kind of the work you've all done to uncover these kind of the direct links, particularly along what Amira is kind of talking about like data-driven tools of war and like autonomous kind of drone technologies. I know, for example, the Deadly Exchange campaign kind of has exposed that LAPD officials kind of went to Israel to present at a kind of big data policing conference and those kinds of things. So if Craig, if you want to just talk about that and kind of the connections between occupation here and there.
Sure. I have less to say on the data stuff, and maybe some of my friends on the call might chime in, but I'll give just like a kind of quick, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really enjoying this and learning so much. And I had all these notes I prepared, and now I have all these other things I want to talk about off of what I was hearing about Skid Row. But I'll just kind of say quickly, so JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, sort of launched this campaign to end the deadly exchange some years ago now. It's also been like picked up by, thanks Jesse, it's been picked up by some other groups. And the goal is to expose and to end training exchanges and sharing of information technology ideas between US military and policing and Israeli military and policing. And speaking of which, sorry, helicopter circling. And these links, so there's different organizations that facilitate these trainings, and the way that JVP sort of has developed to talk about them as we talk about it as an exchange of worst practices. And you know, these are exchanges between two different settler-colonial states, the United States and Israel, but also one of which is an empire, the United States, which is largely funding and supplying, you know, the weapons and arms and various kinds of aid for the Israeli occupation of historic Palestine. And these exchanges are organized by different entities. One of the ones that JVP in particular has focused on is the Anti-Defamation League, which sort of claims to be a civil rights organization, but has a long history of surveillance and infiltration of social justice, racial justice movements, and harassment and surveillance in particular of Muslims and Arabs in the United States. And so the Anti-Defamation League has been organizing these exchanges for years, and JVP in particular has been targeting those. I will say, off of General Jogan brought up for us the sort of the history of policing in Skid Row and the role of Bratton in particular there. Bratton has been like a major participant in these exchanges. I was a big fan of these exchanges, helped bring broken windows policing to the Israeli military and police, who then launched a version of broken windows policing in East Jerusalem. And so there's these very direct ties between LAPD in particular, the city of Los Angeles, and what's happening in historic Palestine. One other thing I just wanted to say, and then maybe I'll see if anybody else wants to jump in. off of what Steve was telling us about this kind of, and we got it earlier, I think from Tiff's maps, this kind of like surrounding and sort of choking out and shrinking that's been happening in Skid Row. This is the exact tactic that's happening. I mean, it's what Gaza is as a totality, but it's also what's happening throughout the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. So part of what kicked off what the global protest over the last couple of weeks is the targeting of the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which is in occupied East Jerusalem. And another neighborhood that's on the other side of the old city of Jerusalem, Silwan, is, you may also see some things going on around about Silwan right now. And when I was listening to Steve talk, it's like you could just do like find and replace between Skid Row and Silwan, and what's happening is exactly the same. Silwan has, so it's undergoing all the same kind of like evictions and demolitions that are happening. Sorry, not evictions. The housing seizures and demolitions that are taking place in Sheikh Jarrah is also happening in Silwan. Silwan is one of the most policed parts of all of historic Palestine. I was trying to get some figures. I think the data that I could find was from 2012, where 300 something children in this neighborhood were arrested over the course of that year, and 1,000 something had cases brought against them. And so this sort of extreme concentration of police violence and force, that's like, it is what stop and frisk is meant to do, to sort of destabilize and make life impossible in a neighborhood. It's exactly what everybody here has been describing has been happening in Skid Row, and it's a tactic that's being used in so on and throughout the West Bank, throughout occupied East Jerusalem, and in neighborhoods in the 48 territories as well. So it's like the tactics are exactly the same in terms of like the role of police in destabilizing life and making life impossible to live. But I wonder if anybody else wants to jump in on data stuff.
Yeah, Jesse or Leah, if you want to, just add anything to that, or I can pose questions too, but go ahead.
I can add something quickly. Or Leah, I know you have to leave soon. Is there anything you want to get in before you're out? Okay.
No, go ahead.
Just something I wanted to add was also facial recognition technology. I hadn't heard it mentioned tonight, but I know you all are working around that. And of course, you probably have heard that similar technology has been used throughout historic Palestine. So I think that that's another like technology transfer that we can see so clearly being used across these contexts that are very similar. And I put in the chat as well, anchor points. While you were talking about that, Jamie, I was just thinking about checkpoints in historic Palestine and how similar they can be, not just in terms of the technologies that are set up at these checkpoints, but also just how they're strategically placed so that it's a space wherein Palestinians are harassed endlessly for things like identification documents or, you know, anything arbitrarily that Israeli police and military can do. So those are just the 2 points I wanted to bring up.
Yep, maybe I'll just tack onto that. I was just reading today, getting ready for this. I didn't know this before, but skunk water or whatever is that we've just seen unleashed. You know, the city of Ferguson started purchasing that after the uprising in Ferguson. And so I think, you know, part of what I'm thinking about while we're talking is like the combination of this, of the high tech, of maybe what's coming from this fourth industrial revolution. It's the first time I heard that, but with like all this kind of low tech stuff, right? And that these things are happening together to create conditions that are in which there's like a constant show of force and destabilization that is both very intentional and also intentionally unpredictable. That it can sort of, the checkpoint can be open or closed, right? So that that there's sort of the arbitrariness of the sort of power of the state is exercised as much as like the power itself. It's like the fact that it could happen at any time and that it can't be, that it's both, yes, you can predict it and also you can't predict exactly like how and when it will unfold.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when you're talking about this arbitrariness, I mean, it just sounds kind of directly linked to how General Dogon was talking about, like even the enforcement of kind of drug laws and just the criminalization that is just kind of an exercise of raw power, and just police have all of these kind of tools, and that includes like the technological tools, but really just as much as that, the legal tools, like the ordinances, the like, you know, city municipal code. And so they could just like that decide, like General Dogan was saying, that like, oh, all these cases are not going to get plea deals, and we're just going to railroad everyone straight to state prison. And that's kind of, yeah, the direct link we're also seeing when we, in you know, in Israel, and I think we could also make the case here, there's no real separation between what we think of as warfare and also just what we kind of think of as law and order. And of course, like what we're seeing in the past couple of days with this kind of campaign of mass arrests and mass incarceration in historic Palestine in 48 is yeah, that kind of exact direct link. So yeah, I wanted to, or if Craig, if you have to jump, or if you either way, if you can stay, yeah.
I can say, I just wanted to add to that, that's actually one of the things that have been exactly pointed to in terms of like, sort of the Israeli state's innovation in terms of sort of blending it's like across these like security forces and sort of facilitating between them was modeled in these exchanges for U.S. policing. I think generally it's like helpful to always just remember, you know, it's like when we're in a settler colony, so it's like the police is a military force, but it hasn't always functioned in that sort of integrated way that the state of Israel is sort of modeling for us. So you zeroed in on something very specific to these exchanges there.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. Oh, and just a footnote. Yeah, Craig earlier mentioned the skunk water, which is basically, it's like these like kind of tanks that shoot this like unbearably smelly and just disgusting water that makes it like, you know, it's to get rid of kind of crowds and protests. And yeah, so the Ferguson Police Department and other police departments have been purchasing that after seeing it, you know, tested and verified as a great way for crushing dissent in protests in Palestine. So, okay, so my next kind of questions, yeah, based on what Craig was just saying, actually, of, yeah, like how the Israeli occupation is this real model of kind of like really no separation between policing, you know, prosecution, criminalization, those things that we talk about as kind of in the US, we think of as domestic and warfare, and just, you know, from the kind of, you know, moment that the Zionist state was established, kind of that's been one thing. And I think along the same lines, we also kind of see in Israel a real, you know, that same period is when we see the development of what we call in the US, the military industrial complex, and the whole kind of industry that surrounds the development of these technologies, including companies that are producing shit both for the US military to use in its imperialism all over the world, as well as for our local police to use. And so if all of y'all can touch a little bit on that same thing of, because yeah, not only does Israel, you know, is the state kind of its rise is during this kind of era of military industrial complex in the US, the Israeli kind of military industrial complex and the like whole kind of industries that exist, so many of which are you know, directly to like the state industry of surveillance and militarization there is so directly tied to IDF and is kind of an empire of its own. So can you talk a little bit about those kind of the private industry around this stuff and just that whole complex and what that kind of teaches us here? Because like folks have been talking about, and Dogan was talking about the business improvement districts, and we see also kind of in the role of nonprofits that kind of contribute to police reform, as well as like the industries, that whole ecosystem is part of how we organize here. And Jamie was talking about the algorithmic ecology and kind of we take into account that whole ecology. So can you talk about kind of lessons about that from thinking about Israel and Palestine? And that's any of you, Jesse, Craig, whoever, yeah. I'm gonna make.
I had a couple things, Jesse. Do you have anything that you want to jump in with, or should I?
Go for it.
Sure, I'll start. Just like two things off of this, and this is great. These are great questions. So I think that year that I could find was like 2019. The US gave $3.8 billion in military aid to the Israeli state, but over 70% of that was spent on buying things from US based corporations, right? So like another way to say this is that it's like a transfer of US taxpayer money to the private military industrial complex, just like routed first through the Israeli state. And so it's like, this is the US like building up its own empire, both by building up like a functional proxy state, but also by funneling tax money, taxpayers' money into more profits for that military industrial complex. So that's like one way to think about it, kind of flowing in that direction. Another like good example of what these police exchanges have kind of looked like in their relationship to the sort of military industrial complex is there was a head of police or somebody from Boston who had traveled on one of these exchange trips and was taught about the tactics used at Ben Gurion Airport, which is, it's like the only airport. Palestinians living in the West Bank can't even use this airport, but people coming, anybody coming in, otherwise coming through this airport, and they not only like studied the tactics of racial profiling that were used at this airport, but then the Logan Airport in Boston hired the security company headed by the former head of security at Ben Gurion Airport to develop new like screening protocols at Logan Airport in Boston. And so, so very directly, these tactics being traded, but also the this like kind of military security industrial complex being invested in through these exchanges. Jesse, anybody else want to add to that?
The only thing I can add is maybe at the university level, but I don't know if is this the time for that, Shakir? Or...
That'd be great. Yeah, let's go there for sure.
Okay. Yeah, just thinking about this ecology, which I think is a really fruitful way to bring together these forms of policing and state violence. At the university level, what we confront is number one, the existence of researchers and research institutions funded by so many of the institutions that have already been mentioned today, including the LAPD. I know everybody here already knows about Jeffrey Brantingham, probably. That's just one example. We also have Steven Soberoff, who is a police commissioner. He's also the CEO of Playa Vista, I think, which is a real estate firm. He also serves as a senior lecturer at the Luskin School of Public Policy at UCLA. So you kind of see the imbrication of individuals and institutions committed to the existence and perpetuation of these policing systems that we all want to abolish at the university. And it's not sort of a, yeah, thank you, Shakir, also, right. And he also donates, frankly, I'm a scholar at UCLA as well, and he donates to other institutions at UCLA, including, I believe, I'm not sure of, but the Nazarian Institute for Israel Studies. So you kind of see how, I don't want to point out just to individuals because it's also a structural problem, right? And you also see institutes at UCLA preventing the teaching of Palestine in a very real way. Like you'll have scholars coming, like Rabab Abdul-Hadi came 2 years ago and was immediately accused of anti-Semitism during her speech. And, now we have the Department of Education investigating UCLA for, I think, the third time in like 10 years. So I don't want to get too far off track, because I know that's not exactly the focus of like the military apparatuses that you guys are interested in highlighting, but it also just creates a campus atmosphere in which there is a fear of talking about Palestine and talking about something like these military exchanges because of the sort of backlash that we're seeing, because already these institutions of policing and across the US and Palestine are hold power at the university level as well. You see it also just in like tenure battles of certain professors, right? Robin D.G. Kelly just went out and posted on Twitter not too long ago that his support for Palestine was a problem in his being granted tenure at UCLA. So I hope that's not like too far off a topic, but I just kind of want to bring that into the discussion. And, we have kind of like a 6-part campaign that JVP at UCLA is trying to launch. I'm going to just pop it in the chat because I don't want to take too much time describing all of our goals, but a few of them are, identifying organizations on campus that invite IDF soldiers and other policing institutions to campus to hold events, right? This is another way that the military industrial complex makes it into the daily life of students at the university. Locating the connection of LAPD to UCPD, and both police departments participating in training with Israeli military and police. So we're trying to like research that more as well. And identifying, you know, folks and campaigning for LAPD and Israeli police state affiliated folks to be removed from all positions at UCL, right? Because this doesn't create an environment that's generative for students to be engaging with the issue of Palestine and the issue of settler colonialism writ large. So I guess that I just wanted to add those as a couple ways in which that ecology like makes it into educational institutes in kind of like really sinister ways, and sometimes less like overtly obvious as like, oh, they're supporting this particular technology, but no, instead they're stifling any discussion about this type of technology or these types of comparisons across US policing and Israeli policing, for example. So I'll stop there.
And you didn't ask me, but I could add maybe, and I think it comes from the Deadly Exchange report, if I'm not mistaken, but the LAPD officers going to Israel to visit private corporations there who are working on surveillance technologies. So like NICE, and there's this one called Spy, I almost said Spy Sapiens, but it's called Sky Sapiens. And there I can drop, this is a quote from an article that I can drop the link to, but here, the LAPD officer is saying, wow, you know, from this company, Sky Sapiens, there are these things called hover mast that are like drone-like kinds of little spying things that can, you know, collect all of this data. And the comment was like, that would be great. We would love to have hover mast, but it has its challenges from a political standpoint, convincing our political leaders and convincing the community that it's not Big Brother watching over you. So I think there's also an exchange around justification and legitimation, you know, this idea of like in the report about the victory strategy and the multi-domain systems, part of what that report talks about in so many words is labeling civilians as enemy combatants in order to justify the warfare, you know? So, you know, it talks about rocket wielding terror enemies or something like that as a way of, again, legitimizing the airstrikes on Gaza. So that was just part of that report, but I think we can link that to the efforts to legitimize these kinds of spy surveillance technologies as well.
Yeah, thanks, Amir, for saying that. Yeah, because I was gonna, as Jesse was saying, you know, like, does this feel to a field? No, I think absolutely not. I think, you know, universities are factories for the production, not only of the actual technologies and the weapons, but like you're saying, Amira, the ideologies and the political concepts that are used to expand policing, sanitize policing, justify it. And so when we talk about academic complicity in policing, it's that whole range, and it includes like even like, you know, what you're quoting now, like Horace Frank saying here, or what's in that momentum report from IDF, is it's kind of, I mean, maybe this is a stretch, but I don't think so. It's like it's kind of like the process even of reform here, of like, oh, we need to come up with these kind of new concepts for selling politically or repackaging or shock absorbing kind of criticism of our past strategies. And universities are factories for producing those concepts and for producing and researching and normalizing all of that. So yeah, I think absolutely related. Yeah, broken windows policing, exactly, like as a reality that, or a concept that had to be invented by academics. So I want to open it up to questions and discussion from anyone here. But just real quick, as Craig, you mentioned, you know, the U.S. companies that are selling, you know, when we're talking about military aid, it's really just, you know, it's just the money comes back to U.S. companies. And just, I want to just name, being in L.A., you know, a lot of these companies have a lot of operations here, you know, and like, especially in El Segundo, that's where Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, a bunch of these companies, and Boeing, for example, is the one that if folks saw in the news this week, you know, right on the heels of this, you know, relentless bombardment of Gaza, the Biden administration approved $735 million in direct weapon sales to the Israeli military, and that's just all Boeing weaponry, and specifically it's precision guided. The weapon, it's weaponry that has no use besides for bombing Gaza. It's not like the Iron Dome self-defense stuff. It's not kind of long range stuff that they can claim is for protecting from regional threats or anything. It's literally just the US is restocking through a $735 million to Boeing, which has a lot of operations here, just new bombs that Israel can drop on Gaza. So thanks, a lot to share here, a lot that folks have been sharing here, and I have more questions, but yeah, if anyone has questions from the group, either in the chat or Hamid, if we want to let people open the mic. Oh, I see here. Yeah, Jamie, do you want to ask it out loud?
Sure. I don't know if I was reading it or where I was getting this idea, but there were apparently, I was hearing about like Israeli courts passing like laws or pseudo laws or whatever over like land rights and housing rights that would basically legitimized like taking of homes. And that these courts, these laws were being passed in Israeli courts, like Palestinians were not having any kind of obviously say in that. And I don't know if anybody knows a little bit about that, because just building off of what Steve was talking about, like there would be these like zoning housing laws that are passed, and then like policing would come either precede it or after it to like enforce it. And so I was just, it's been in the back of my head, but I wanted to know maybe if there's obviously that practice going on where there's an attempt to legitimize the land grabs.
Yeah, it's a decades long practice. And I think the way that it usually works is that you are required, according to law, you're required to have a permit in order to build anything. And so Palestinians are just routinely denied permits. So any building they would do then can be recursively, like after the fact, oh, well, you didn't have a permit, and then it justifies the home demolition. I think that's the sort of order in which it usually works. So for instance, like in Sheikh Jarrah, if you've heard about Mohammed al-Kurd, who's been reporting, like citizen reporting out of there, part of that has been, went viral, an interaction between his sister and a settler who is occupying their home. And that part of the home that the occupier is, the settler is occupying is, was an addition that they built and couldn't get a permit for. And so that's part of what's playing out there, for instance.
I'll just tack on to that. And one of the, and I don't know if people have heard of this recently too, but one of the, to me, one of the, I mean, you can't really, just one more like incredibly like malicious, cruel aspect of what colonization occupation looks like here is that Palestinians will then be fined for the demolition of their illegal additions to their homes. And so, and can go into debt for these fines. And so what families often wind up having to make the like incredibly cruel choice to demolish their own homes so that they don't go into debt in addition to losing their homes. And you see these like, there's a film that I saw about this, of these like families like, like brick by brick sort of taking their own homes apart. Yeah, anyway, I just wanted to add that to the sort of what this really looks like for people there on the ground. It's not dissimilar really to like, the evictions going on in encampments around LA right now. The sort of people being forced to dismantle the communities that they've established and been living in.
If I could add one thing to that really quick, especially in the case of Sheikh Jarrah, I think it's just really important to keep in mind that this is like the third displacement in many cases for families in Sheikh Jarrah. Many of them were originally displaced in 47 or 48 from Haifa and, established homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And this is like, for some of these families, the fourth or fifth time of displacement as the settler-colonial project advances. And a lot of the documents being contested over are Ottoman and British imperial documents for land, rights. And frequently the Ottoman and the British, you can read a book about Leora Helper and wrote a pretty good book about how like frequently Jewish and non-Jewish Palestinian families would have land documents, or, you know, what we might call deeds for the same property, because there's these competing imperial, you know, powers operating in the region. But current Israeli courts, no matter what, do completely disregard Palestinian documents and will only give hearings sometimes in courts to any sort of Jewish claims via these Ottoman or British imperial documents. And so I don't know, I think it's just always important to keep in mind that particularly for the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, this is probably the third or fourth displacement for many of these families from their original homes throughout historic Palestine.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that just reminds me, you know, I mean, that's kind of I'm a lawyer, and like this, like the same kind of overlapping regimes of efforts to have kind of sovereign native courts here. And even what you were talking about, Craig, of like, you know, how the like those cruel choices. I mean, that's not dissimilar to how bail operates here and how criminal debt operates here, forcing people to, like General Dong was saying, like that's how railroading occurs, is like you kind of have no choice but to take a plea deal or something like that because of the stakes of it. So yeah, I see Charles, you have your hand up. You want to share a question?
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if it's a question so much, but hopefully a contribution to the discussion. First of all, you know, thanks to you, Shakir, to, you know, Jesse and Craig as well for, you know, really excellent informative presentation on this. I guess what I wanted to add was, you know, I feel it would be sort of remiss not to, you know, mention as well the tactics of the Palestinian resistance and what we can learn from them. Because, you know, this may not be very obvious, I think, from like even a lot of the like progressive slash left coverage of, you know, what has been happening in Palestine, particularly in Gaza, and in the past several weeks. But you know, the general sort of impression that I get from following, you know, certain accounts associated with the resistance directly is that they consider, you know, at least in terms of this particular flare-up, they consider it to have been a tactical victory for them, a tactical defeat for Israel. You know, in terms of this sort of IDF plan that was mentioned earlier, you know, their operational concept for victory, you know, basically the general consensus seems to be that Israel, you know, was forced into, you know, declaring a ceasefire without really achieving any of its military objectives, without really being able to operationalize much of this plan. And a huge part of that, you know, is not just that the resistance has, you know, raised its technological sophistication in terms of its ability to respond, but you know, the huge level of popular mobilization as well, right, throughout all of occupied Palestine. And that seems like something that we can really learn from. Because, you know, what I kept hearing over and over is like, for the first time almost, you know, that in living memory for a lot of these people, you know, when, you know, Palestinians came under attack in Sheikh Jarrah, in Al-Aqsa, you know, it wasn't just the Palestinians of East Jerusalem who responded. It was Gaza that responded. It was the West Bank that responded. It was Palestinians all across, you know, like the occupied territory of 48. It was the Palestinian diaspora. It was their allies around the world. And, you know, I think that given that today is the anniversary of George Floyd's death, I think we can, you know, think about this in analogy to what it was ultimately. Well, sorry. My bad. That, like, you know, when George Floyd was murdered, what really caught the state off guard was that it wasn't just a localized uprising in Minneapolis. You know, LA answered, New York answered, Seattle answered, Portland answered. There were sort of escalations all across, you know, the United States and in solidarity abroad as well. And I think that, you know, in terms of building kind of a national consciousness of resistance, there is so much that we can learn from the Palestinian resistance in terms of how that's been sustained over the decades, and in terms of how, of course, this isn't like a final victory, right? And we're seeing, massive reprisals from Israel now, with the assurance that some of the media spotlight is off them now. But I think we should emphasize that in a very real sense, this was seen as a victory, in the setting of particularly the most intense phase of the conflict, and that we have a lot of lessons to learn about the role that popular mobilization and really this massive response, across a Palestinian population that's been so balkanized intentionally by Israel, all the lessons that we can derive from that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. I mean, Palestinian resistance is in our lifetimes just, the absolutely powerful resistance existing and settler colonialism, and kind of the most technologically resourced forms of that and the most powerful forms of that. And I think, what we saw this week or this past, even just with the kind of culmination of the violence in Gaza is that there's the technological edge that the Israeli military has, but the kind of moral and political edge, obviously that's what the resistance has. And I think that kind of what Charles was just saying also makes me think of what Amira was saying, of even this whole kind of fancy like fucking document out here is really just like repackaging even the whole idea of like decisive victory is just like a bunch of fancy words for talking about collective punishment, for talking about just the killing of civilian populations intentionally, and how that's just the same shit that they've always done, but this is just like kind of a fancy intellectual dressing up of it, and ultimately it's the resistance that remains the same and prevails. Any other questions or any more thoughts you want to share, either Amira, Jesse, or Craig, or questions from the group?
I have one question is, if we could talk real quick again, Craig and Jesse, just remind us how to get involved. What are the current things that are happening that we can engage in? Obviously, right now is a time to keep pressure on, a time for us to all continue to stay engaged as we speak about resistance right now. Obviously, it's now that, kind of, it's like when you're a headline, everyone's kind of involved, and then, this fake kind of like, whatever ceasefire that they're talking about, I think now is even more the time for us to keep, the pressure up. So what can we do, and, what should we be tuning into?
I can share a few links that I'll gather. I'm going to share right now the BDS Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction Movement links. Many folks here are probably already familiar, but there's been a general call to continue participating and publishing the BDS movement and to participate in the boycott. So I've passed that link here. There's also a map of actions happening around the nation that Jewish Voice for Peace Action National has prepared that I'll share in the chat shortly. I mean, there's quite a few big marches happening soon. If anybody here is in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, there'll be a march on Washington, but I know there will be further actions happening here in Los Angeles as well. Last week, on Saturday, or it was 2 weeks ago, we had 25,000 people march to the Israeli consulate in Los Angeles. So it was really such an amazing moment. I bet a lot of people here were there, and I anticipate that there'll be many more actions like that in the coming days, probably. I'll share those links in the chat.
Thank you.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. Thanks, Jesse, for all that. And yeah, I really appreciate this last question for us. It's so important to us. And I think this is one of the things that's been so amazing in this moment as Palestinians are on like CNN talking about ethnic cleansing and white supremacy. I mean, we are living in an incredible historic moment. And I think one of the most effective things that's happened through that sort of breaking through this kind of most conversations about Palestine happen in the US with no Palestinians. And that's really like crumbled in these last weeks. And I think those young organizers and activists have done an amazing job of saying, nothing here is exceptional. This is what daily life in Palestine has been for 73 plus years. And so that while this ceasefire is being celebrated, understandably, because it's allowing people to live, it's a step. And I think from the perspective of the US and the US media, they really want to rush to say that something has just ended. But we know this is just a moment. And so I just really appreciate that question, because it's so important that we refuse that sort of narrative that something has ended. But while we also pick up exactly what Charles was telling us, which is that we are in a historic moment. There's an opening that there hasn't been in the United States around these conversations and these solidarities. And so it's really key that we keep that momentum going.
Thank you. And yeah, just as we maybe close out with, if anyone has announcements, just one thing, and thanks Amira for sharing the link to PYM's page. PYM is a close partner of ours in our War on Youth campaign, which is maybe I never know which Tuesday, but also, keep an eye out. PYM has been leading and just fucking working, 24 hours a day, organizing and planning actions and mobilizations around. So we're supporting them on those. So keep an eye out for those. And any other announcements, Hamid or Jamie, before we close out?
No, just next the Tuesday, the 1st of June would be our first Tuesday of the month webinar, which would be gender and sexuality. And the War on Youth one is the second Tuesday. So that's when that happens.
Dogon, you want to say something?
Hey, what's up? No, I'm good. Just power to the people. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks, Jesse, Amira, Craig, for sharing so much. Yep. All right, everyone. Take care. Thanks for.
Thank you for having us. This was great. Thanks very
Good
much.
night, everyone. Thank you so much.